Greetings, booktubers. Welcome back to Grammaticus Books. Welcome to a Sunday Comics edition of Grammaticus Books that we're shooting on a Monday that probably won't get posted until Tuesday morning, but we're going to call it Sunday Comics anyway. And we're calling it Sunday Comics because today we are talking about Heavy Metal, the magazine, the graphic magazine, sort of a alternative underground magazine where creators could publish their works that were extremely violent, had a heavy dose of erotica, and because it was in magazine form, they could get away with that because it circumvented the Comics Code Authority that was in place back in 1977. And that was the purpose of the magazine, was to give creators an outlet where they could push the bounds of what was acceptable in the comic books and just make these stories that they wanted to with as much violence and as much erotica as they wanted to put into it. And it was actually derived from a French magazine. This started in 1977 in the United States, but the magazine actually began in France in 1975. It was called Metal Hurlant, which loosely translated means screaming metal. And again, in France, this was an outlet, a creative outlet for artists over there who wanted to push the bounds of what was typically being published at that time. Because prior to that, what you had over in France was the adventures of Tintin and Asterix, these comic book-like cartoon characters. And so you had all these frustrated artists, and this acted as an outlet for them in order to do more mature, more adult themed stories and get their graphic works published in this magazine. And it was so successful in France that the United States opened up its own version of it, but they retitled it from Screaming Metal, Metal Hurlant, to Heavy Metal. And I think Heavy Metal is a much better title for the magazine. And it was very successful. This ran from 1977 all the way to the year 2023. So they were publishing this still back in 2023. And the Heavy Metal website is still up, it's still active. You can log on to it and you can order merch and a product off of that website. So it was very successful for almost 50 years. It ran. And this is the second issue of Heavy Metal ever published here, with a cover by Jean Girard, aka Moebius, here on the front. And then you've got a Pierre Droulet cover on the back that is really nice. Really like that Pierre Droulet cover. And this magazine featured a lot of comic book creators that you're probably very familiar with, such as Richard Corben and again Moebius. And both of those are here in this magazine. They would publish a number of features in each magazine. And let me open it up here and show you some of it. Here's Droulet. He's got his feature in here, black and white. Really spectacular stuff. Great artistic style here by Droulet. Like it a lot. To me, it's very reminiscent of late Barry Windsor Smith. But the two big stories in this issue here, the heavy hitters, are going to be Richard Corben with his story Neverwhere. So here's Richard Corben, Neverwhere. This is the second issue in that series. And issue number 1 would have had to start to Neverwhere. What just great stuff. I love Richard Corben. His use of his colors, he was ahead of a time with the color work that he was doing on there. His style is uniquely his own, and it's great. I mean, look at this action panel up here in the upper left. And I would describe Den, Neverwhere, as sort of a John Carter Warlord of Mars, but on a much more surreal world and filled with a lot more extreme violence and erotica than John Carter of Mars. And then the other big story that you had in here was, bear with me while I flip to it. There we go. Arzak, which is a character created by Moebius. He flew around on his tame pterodon, his steed, his giant pterodon, who he would fly around on this sci-fi adventure planet. He never spoke. There's no dialogue in any of these Arzak stories. It's one of his more popular characters. And just look at how beautifully drawn that is. Just fantastic stuff. This episode here is flying over a gigantic field of these plants that are deadly to anybody who lands in them. And then there's only one trestle in the middle of this field of these deadly plants. And he has to fight for it with this giant monster to see who will survive. It's a little reminiscent of The Garden of Fear by Robert E. Howard, which was one of his James Allison stories. And so you just had all these fantastic, great stories that would push the bounds of what was acceptable here, starting in 1977 with Heavy Metal, the magazine. Here's some other covers. from heavy metal from the late 70s and early 80s. You can kind of get a flavor for where it was going, the types of stories it would put in it. Oop, I almost lost that one. This is a very good one here. That's very, very, very typical, emblematic of a heavy metal cover. And it was great stuff. But it was so successful that in 1981, they produced a movie of heavy metal, which is called Heavy Metal the Movie, which was an animated production of the magazine. And it was essentially just taking the magazine and putting it in almost an exact magazine form up in this movie that back in 1981 was absolutely groundbreaking. It was mind-blowing. It was basically an unapologetic mashup of horror, science fiction, fantasy, and adventure, shot through with drugs, rock and roll, and a heavy dose of soft porn animation up on the movie screen. And it was glorious. I mean, nobody had seen anything like this. I mean, if you were a kid, and I was a high schooler back in 1981, the only comics and cartoons that you were familiar with at this time were Hong Kong Phooey, Fat Albert, the Super Friends, Scooby-Doo. I mean, that was comics. Because you got to remember that manga and anime hasn't taken off in the United States at this time. It's not going to pick up, manga and anime that is, until the 1990s. And so this was absolutely mind-blowing when it came out in 1981. And when I and my other high school buddies, we saw the cartoons for this or the commercials up on our TV set, our cathode ray tube TV sets with 3 channels that you had to get up and turn with the knob in order to select the channels and change it. We absolutely were just like, we have got to go see this movie. And I'm going to tell a little story about going to see this movie for the first time in 1981 as a high schooler. So the weekend rolls around, and my friends and I, we've got to see this movie. We all pile into a car, and we drive out to the airport drive-in on the east side of town. The airport drive-in, big gravel lot on the east side of the city, huge screen in the back of it. You pull in your car, and you pay one fee no matter how many people you've stuffed into the car. So you've filled it with as many of your friends as you can. And you roll through, and then you've got the lanes that you can drive down and park in your spot. And if you recall the drive-ins, the spots were all designated by a big steel pole that had a big metal speaker on it with a giant metal cable that attached the speaker to the pole. And you pull up next to your pole, and you take this metal speaker off, roll down your window. Yes, I said roll down your window, and then hang it on your window and hope to God it didn't crack the glass on your window. And then you had your tinny sound in order to watch the movie. And in the middle of this giant parking lot of all these cars, there was a concession stand. And the concession stand, you could get hot dogs, pizza, hamburgers, popcorn, pop, and beer. Because in 1981, they would sell beer at these things. And in 1981, at the airport drive-in on the east side of town, it was pretty much the epicenter of redneck culture in the city. And now I use the word redneck lovingly because I live amongst the rednecks now. I consider myself an honorary redneck, and it has warmed my heart that in the year 2024, how many people, how many recent immigrants, and how many Americans here in our great country have so readily adopted the redneck culture. Because in the year 2024, rednecks come in all shapes, colors, sizes, creeds, religions, and sexes, and it's a fantastic thing. But back in 1981, redneck culture meant exactly every stereotype that you can think of times 10, turned up to 11 out at the airport drive-in on the east side of the city. So we get there, we pull into our parking place, roll down our window, carefully hang the speaker on it, trying not to crack the glass on the window, and are getting ready for the movie. When lo and behold, down the aisle in front of us that people drove their cars and walked up and forth to get to the concession stand, this redneck comes stumbling along from the left, and he is weaving 2 to 3 feet from left to right as he goes by our car, because he's 3 sheets to the wind before the movie is even started. He's probably 12 beers into a case of beer at this point, and he's got a bottle of Budweiser in his hand. And then coming the other way from the right is a brand new red Mustang. And he walks right into the front of the Mustang, stumbles into it. It takes his brain about 3 or 4 seconds to process the fact that he's bumped into a car and that he now has to move around it. So slowly it cuts through the alcohol that he's got to walk around the car. So he stumbles around to the side in front of us, walks along the side of the car, and just as he's clearing the back of the Mustang, as the Mustang starts to pull forward, for some reason known only to him and the alcohol that he's drunk, he takes his beer bottle, turns around, and he smashes it over the back of this brand new Mustang. And we're just looking at this tableau unfolding in front of us, this story playing out in front of us and before the movie, before we get the story of the movie, in amazement. And he smashes the bottle, and now he's confused because he goes to take a drink of his bottle and it's not there. And his alcoholic brain is trying to process why his bottle that he wants to take a drink of is now no longer in his hand. Meanwhile, the Mustang has rolled about 5 or 6 feet forward and come to a stop. And as we're watching this, we suddenly see the brake lights, the rear tail lights on the Mustang click on. You hear the engine rev, it drops into gear, and then it just backs into him and smashes into this redneck and sends him flying 10 feet through the air to where he lands in a crumpled heap of dust about 10 feet down from us. And we're like, oh my God, he just killed that redneck. But God loves drunks. And this redneck gets himself up like nothing at all has happened, dusts himself off, and then just stands up and starts weaving down the aisle like this all happens every day. This is an everyday occurrence. He was probably so drunk that he couldn't feel the 7 cracked ribs and a broken hip that he had sustained from this car impact that he got. And then the Mustang puts itself back into drive, and then it rolls down the other way. And then the movie started, and it was glorious. It was the perfect start to Heavy Metal, the motion picture here from 1981. That was our introduction to heavy metal. So Heavy Metal, the motion picture, it was an unapologetic mashup of fantasy, science fiction, horror, rock and roll, drugs, and soft animated porn up on the screen back in 1981. And it was absolutely mind-blowing. You got to remember, anything you could see at this point was basically Fat Albert and Scooby-Doo. So this was just out there, and it was fantastic. It had us absolutely mesmerized, and unbelievably great entertainment there back in 1981. These are hand-drawn cells, thousands and thousands of hand-drawn cells that made extensive use of rotoscoping, especially in the feature Tarna, which was influenced by and inspired by Moebius, his Arzak story out of the magazine from 1977. It was fantastic stuff. It had a number of features here in the film that were some of the more popular stories that came out of the magazine, such as Harry Canyon was one that was done by Goldberg and Bloom. And it was also inspired by The Long Tomorrow by Moebius. And it's about a cab driver in New York City, hundreds and hundreds of years in the future, where New York City is this sort of this dystopian place, and he's got a cab that has a death ray in the back seat and can shoot laser beams out of the tail lights. And they are trying to sell this evil green orb called the Lochnar. And it was a great story. The Lochnar was the sort of the magical MacGuffin, this evil green sphere that could travel through time and space that connected all the different stories. At the start of the movie, the green Lochnar comes down to this house, which you assume is on Earth. It looks like an Earth-like planet, like out in Iowa somewhere. And it corners this young teenage girl in the house and starts telling her these stories of how it has perpetrated this evil. And it leads as the connector between all the different stories in here. Originally, they were going to go with a magical merry-go-round, but instead they decided to switch to the evil Lochnar. And I think that was a great idea, instead of going with a magical merry-go-round to tell each one of the individual stories. So Harry Canyon was in here. You had Captain Stern by Bernie Wrightson, which was a science fiction comedy skit or animated feature that was really good. It was very excellent. And all of these individual features were drawn in the exact artistic style of the original creators, which made it just that much more interesting and gave it that much more depth and variety up on the screen. And then, of course, you had Den of Earth, his Neverwhere story was in here as well, which was just excellent by Richard Corben. And then the main feature in here was Tarna, the Last Trakian, who's on the cover, which was inspired heavily by Moebius. It is basically Arzak up on the screen, exactly in Moebius's own artistic style up there. But interestingly, for some reason, they did not credit Moebius here in the movie for having been the inspiration for Tarna, who is basically just a female version of Arzak. I thought that was pretty interesting. The soundtrack on here was awesome. It was just filled with fantastic rock and roll music, such as Black Sabbath, Blue Oyster Cult, Cheap Trick, Devo, Donald Fagen, Don Felder, Grand Funk Railroad, Sammy Hagar, Journey, Nazareth, Stevie Nicks, Riggs, and Trust. And the Devo song in here, which was Veterans of the Psychic Wars, which was written for this movie, was actually written by Eric Bloom of Blue Oyster Cult, and Michael Moorcock of Elric fame helped write that song, Veterans of the Psychic Wars, that made it into this movie. Something a lot of people don't know, but I think that's a really interesting tie-in. It had fantastic voice acting as well. You had Ivan Reitman was the producer, but the voice acting was done in part by John Candy, the famous John Candy, may he rest in peace, and Harold Ramis. So you had great voice acting with it, with these fantastic stories that were going with it as well. And there was a sequel that they made of this. It was called Heavy Metal 2000. It wasn't nearly as good. And Heavy Metal 2000 was influenced by the Eastman, Talbot, and Bisley comic book that was called Melting Pot. But the sequel to it really wasn't nearly as good as this one here, which is just an underground cult classic. A fantastic movie if you haven't seen it. And I've got a cover here. Let me pull it out. Here you go. Here's a cover preview of the sequel to Heavy Metal 2000 and sort of the style. This is much better than the comic book style that made it up on the screen. It was much more cartoonish. But that's a lead-in to the sequel to Heavy Metal, the animated motion picture. The influence that this had was pretty significant. Love, Death, was it Love, Death, and Robots, or is it Death, Love, and Robots from Netflix? I can never keep that straight. It's sort of the spiritual successor here to Heavy Metal. It has influenced heavily the movie The Fifth Element with Bruce Willis as he's the cab driver, just like Harry Canyon, piloting his cab around this dystopian future city that looked very, very much like Harry Canyon City here from the movie. And also another influence you had was sort of Elon Musk. And maybe influence is the wrong word, but an homage. Elon Musk, whatever you think of him, one of the things he did with his SpaceX, I think he's shot a rocket into space. And in this rocket, he had one of his Tesla convertibles, and they dropped the Tesla convertible out into orbit, and they had put a mannequin of a man in an astronaut's outfit in the driver's seat of the Tesla. And that was a direct homage to the opening scene here out of Heavy Metal that was called Soft Landing. But this thing here, Heavy Metal, the motion picture, it was basically a teenage boy's science fiction adventure fantasy shot through with a bunch of erotica. And when I say erotica, there was some animated sex in here, but if you were to shoot this live action today, it would probably get like an R rating. But back in 1981, I mean, this was very much cutting edge, very much pushing the bounds and maybe breaking the bounds of what was acceptable back in 1981. And it had a huge influence. It was a great little underground film that you had to go to drive-in movie theaters in order to see. But it was well worth the adventure to go out there. Plus, not only watching the movie, you never knew what you were going to see at the drive-in theater to boot. And it was a lot of fun. If you haven't seen this movie, I recommend checking it out. It is great stuff. And with that, I'm going to wrap this one up and say take care, be safe, and I will catch you guys next time.